We'll do all two verses. Again, that's number 18. Faithful love flowing down from the thorn-covered crown makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love calms each fear, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love from above came to earth to show the Father's love, and I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name. Faithful love is a friend just when hope seems to end. Welcome face, sweet embrace, tender touch filled with grace. Faithful love, endless power, living flame, Spirit's fire, burning bright in the night, guiding my way. Faithful love from above came to earth to show the Father's love, and I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name. All right, well, next song will be 716. 716. We'll do all three on this one. 716, Sing to Me of Heaven. Sing to me of heaven. Let me restart that. I'm sorry. Dawn, can you help us get started with this song? Me of heaven, sing the song of peace. From the toils that bind me, it will bring release. Burdens will be lifted that are pressing so. Showers of great blessing o'er my heart will flow. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sing a song of all. Sing to me of heaven as I walk alone, dreaming of the comrades that so long have gone. In a fairer region among the angel throng, they are happy as they sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sing a song of all. Sing to me of heaven tenderly and low, till the shadows o'er me rise and swiftly go. Heart is weary when the day is long. Sing to me of heaven, sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sing the song of all.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day and for all that you've given us in our lives. Lord, we pray that you be with us tonight as we study your word, and pray that we would take things we learned tonight in their hearts and minds, and that we would use what we've learned to help others in their day-to-day lives and understanding Christ better. Father, we pray that you be with those who are on our prayer list and help them in their difficult and challenging times to overcome the challenges in their lives. Lord, we pray you always be our guide and director in our lives and guide our pathway that we walk in. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Alrighty. I'll be honest with you, I'm a little tired today. My wife and I had a very AM morning because we had to shoot up north for a doctor's appointment of mine that was at 8 o'clock this morning. So if I'm a little sluggish today, that is why. So,
Like a 4 o'clock morning start.
yeah, basically. So, but Mark, let's go to Mark chapter 15. And just by way of reminder, I will be gone next week. Mark Collins will be covering the Wednesday night class because my family and I were traveling to California for my stepmother's funeral. So just be aware of that. All right, there's Mark. So Mark chapter 15, we're moving closer to the event of the crucifixion in this chapter. It does occur in this chapter, but we're not quite there yet. But what we're dealing with in the beginning portion of this chapter is Pilate's dealings with Jesus, Pontius Pilate, that is. And from verse 1, we know that the religious leaders, they brought Jesus to Pilate very early in the morning. This is probably Friday morning that we're at, the morning of the crucifixion that would occur later in that day. So it's in that context that as we reach verse 6 of this chapter, Mark records for us, "Now at the feast he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested." Now, as we see in the text in this verse, Mark makes mention of the feast. Can anyone tell me what feast? The Passover feast. This is Passover time that we're at. And so at this Passover feast, according to this verse, what was Pilate used to doing? Release a prisoner of the people's request. Now, with that in mind, I think one thing we should understand here is that what Pilate customarily did here, it's not something that was not entirely foreign in ancient history. There is other instances that at certain times of year, rulers would release prisoners of the people's request in other circumstances. Now, as far as Pilate is concerned, the only evidence we have that Pilate himself did this is what we have written in the Gospels, as mentioned here, and we also find it mentioned in Matthew 27, verse 15, and John 18, verse 39. So anything else on verse 6? Because it really is just a stage-setting verse, but anything else on verse 6? Okay. So again, verse 6 is just one of those stage-setting verses about what Pilate did and what this would lead to in verses 7 through 15, where Mark goes on to make 2 points about how, in addition to this being a custom of Pilate, Pilate had other reasons he wished to release a prisoner to the Jews. Now, the first point Mark makes in verses 7 through 10 is that Pilate offered to release a prisoner because he knew why the religious leaders brought Jesus to him. The second point Mark makes in verses 11 through 15 is that Pilate offered to release a prisoner because he wished to satisfy the crowd. Now, after looking at these things, one application we'll take from this is that we must determine why we have anything to do with Jesus. We'll talk about that when we get there. But if there's nothing else on verse 6, we'll read through verses 7 through 15, and then we'll look at the points. Again, Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 7, we read, "The man named Barabbas had been imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?' For he was aware that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, 'And what shall I do with him whom you call the king of the Jews?' They shouted back, 'Crucify him.' But Pilate said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they shouted all the more, 'Crucify him.' Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified." So again, we're looking at these points about why Pilate was offering to release a prisoner in addition to it just being a custom. And one reason for it was because he knew why the religious leaders brought Jesus to him. So that point is introduced here in verse 7. We're introduced to another person in the story, and that's this individual, Barabbas. Now here in verse 7, what are we told about Barabbas? Okay, so he was an insurrectionist, and there was an insurrection that occurred. Can anyone tell me what an insurrection is? It's a rebellion of sorts. So this man named Barabbas, he was imprisoned because he'd been involved at a rebellion that took place at some point in time, at which point there were also murders that took place. Now, something else we know about Barabbas from John 18, verse 40, is that he was also a robber. And in Matthew 27, verse 16, Barabbas is referred to as a notorious prisoner, meaning that he was famous, possibly because of his involvement with this insurrection that Mark mentions here. Now, since that's true, something else we should understand from this verse is that the insurrection Mark says Barabbas was involved in, this was one of many rebellions that took place beginning as early as 6 AD up until the Jewish War of 66 through 73 AD, and these all took place for the purpose of overthrowing the Romans in the land of Judea, where Jerusalem was located. Now, since that's the case, Barabbas and his involvement in these insurrections, he'd be viewed as a sort of hero to the Jews, and as we'll learn later in the story, he would be the one preferred over Jesus to be released. That's a lot of information. Questions or comments on verse 7? Okay. So verse 8, the attention turns back to the crowd. What does the crowd do in verse 8? That's it. It's a pretty simple statement. The crowd's yelling at him, or the text says in the American Standard, began asking him, telling Pilate, Do what you've always done, Pilate, at this time. Release for us a prisoner. Now, the prisoner they want is not named just yet. But what Mark does not indicate in this verse that we should also know is if this crowd was already planning to ask for Barabbas. Now, Mark does not record that information. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Josephus says there's a reason he offered Barabbas. It wasn't for the reason you're thinking.
Okay.
Barabbas killed a Jew. He didn't kill a Roman when he killed the person that he killed. So he thought they would choose Barabbas, or they would choose Jesus. That's why they put him, because he killed one of his own, not a Roman. So he wasn't a hero for the Jews.
Josephus says this?
He talks about this when he wrote his document, that Barabbas killed a Jew. He didn't kill a Roman. So that's why Pilate chose him, because he would be somebody they despised, and they despised him less than they despised Jesus.
Got it. I did not come across that information, I'll be honest with you. All I knew was that he was involved in this rebellion against the Jews. So apparently Josephus says something more about Barabbas that I did not come across. I apologize for that. But something else we should know here, something we learn about this situation here from Matthew 27, verse 20, is that by this point, the religious leaders had actually persuaded this crowd to ask for Barabbas and put Jesus to death. Again, Mark does not record that information, but over in Matthew 27, we do find it. Anything else on verse 8? Okay. Verse 9, Mark goes on to record Pilate's question. And as the text says there, Pilate says, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" Now, who does Pilate have in mind when he's talking about the King of the Jews from the context? Jesus. He and Jesus had this conversation earlier in the chapter about whether or not he was the King of the Jews. So Pilate asked this question, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" Now, with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that at this point in the story, Pilate's reference to Jesus as King of the Jews probably carries with it a tone of sarcasm and contempt, not only toward Jesus, but to the Jews who were present on this occasion. Now, one reason we might be able to assume this is because of how the Roman soldiers use the term the King of the Jews later when they're placing the crown of thorns on Jesus' head during his tortures, why Pilate might have some sarcasm in his tone because of how the soldiers are going to treat Jesus later in the chapter. But even though that's the case, another possible reason Pilate asked the question in this way is because there's a tradition that says Barabbas' full name was actually Jesus Barabbas. And this may have led to some confusion on Pilate's part, that when the crowd asked for Jesus, he thought they were asking for he wondered if they were asking for Jesus the Christ or Jesus Barabbas, if that was in fact his full name. Now, one reason that's important to remember is because, as I've mentioned before, the name Jesus by itself, very common name at the time. It's the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua. So when you're talking about Jesus, a person might ask, well, which Jesus? And again, that's why we find Jesus referred to as Jesus the Nazarene in some verses in Mark. Again, a lot of information. Questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. So verse 10, we now reach one of those because statements, or for, as the beginning of the verse renders. According to verse 10, what was Pilate aware of? He's aware that, yes, he is aware of that, but why did the religious leaders hand him over, according to this verse? They were jealous. The American Standard has the word envy there. You might have jealous, but Pilate knew this. Pilate knew the religious leaders' attitude toward Jesus. They were envious of him. And we've seen that all through our study of this latter portion of Mark. Now, with that in mind, something else we should know here is that at this point, Pilate is fully aware that Jesus did not commit any real crimes against Rome. Now, we see in other Gospels that at this point, Pilate had already declared him as being innocent. And since that's true, Pilate also did not have any real interest in handling this case against Jesus because Jesus had not committed any crimes against Rome. And so what Pilate's seeking to do here is basically get rid of Jesus, take him off his hands. He did not want to be burdened with the issues the religious leaders had against Jesus more than he already had been up to this point. And again, he knew Jesus, so in short, he knew Jesus was innocent. He didn't want to be involved in this any more than he already was. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. So the point we should see from verses 7 through 10 about why Pilate offered to release a prisoner is that Pilate offered to release a prisoner because he knew why the religious leaders brought Jesus to him. Now again, in these verses, Mark has shown that Pilate had an awareness of why the religious leaders brought him Jesus. In showing this, Mark has shown that Pilate asked if Jesus should be released to them. And what Mark has also shown is that one reason this was occurring is because it was customary for Pilate to do this at Passover time. But moving on, there's another reason Pilate was doing this at this time, and that is because he wished to satisfy the crowd, verses 11 through 15. So we come into verse 11. What does verse 11 tell us? What did the chief priests do?
Stirred up the crowd.
They stirred up the crowd. Now, what does that mean to stir up a crowd?
Well, they got them excited.
Okay, they got them excited. Any other thoughts? That's it, is rallying the crowd in a certain direction. Now, the religious leaders are rallying the crowd in what direction?
What they wanted to happen to go, what they were doing.
To release Barabbas. So this is where we're learning that the religious leaders have this influence on the crowd, and they're telling them, choose Barabbas over Jesus. So what is going on here is that the religious leaders are encouraging this crowd to stick with a choice. Don't choose Jesus, choose Barabbas. And again, we have to remember that part of the reason they're able to do this is because they did exercise a certain degree of influence over the people. Anything else on verse 11? Okay. So verse 12, we come back to Pilate. What does he ask? Okay, he says, what do you want me to do with the King of the Jews? But more specifically, he says, what shall I do with him whom you call the King of the Jews? So we already ran into this idea of the King of the Jews in verse 9 with a similar question. We'll just go back to verse 9 for a minute. In verse 9 he said, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? Verse 12, the question changes slightly. He says, then what shall I do with him whom you call the King of the Jews? So, Pilate is identifying Jesus as the one who the Jews call the King of the Jews. So something else we should understand here is that here Pilate is operating under the assumption that at least some of the Jews were viewing Jesus as their king. And so, in this question, Pilate is asking, what should be done with this individual, Jesus, that at least some of the Jews viewed as their king? And we know, just from our studies, that a lot of people began to view Jesus as this king. Not the spiritual king that he was, but they viewed him as this earthly king. So now Pilate is asking, what do you want me to do with this man? Questions or comments on that? All right, we're moving quickly quickly through this, but that's okay. Verse 13, what's their response to the question? Crucify him. Call for Jesus to be crucified. But they not only respond to the question, they shout it back. Crucify him! So that's how the verse reads. So with that in mind, something else we should understand from this verse is that the phrase they shouted back could also be translated as they shouted again. Now, one reason we know this is because the word back here that we have in our English Bibles, it's a word that means again. This isn't the first time they say, crucify him. And one reason we might assume that is because of something we read in Matthew 27. In Matthew 27, verses 22 and 23, we read that this crowd twice called for Jesus to be crucified at this point. Now, we're going to see it again here in just a couple verses, but this is probably the second instance at this point, because they're just calling for crucifixion over and over again, as we'll see here in verse 14. But anything else on verse 13? Okay, verse 14, Pilate asks another question. What does he ask? What evil has he done? How do the crowds answer that question in verse 14? They just say, crucify him again. Are they answering his question? No. So what does this say about the crowd?
They're about the same as the chief priests.
Okay, that's true. They're the
Mindless hate.
okay, mindless hate. Any other thoughts about how? It's kind of a mob mentality here. They're no longer thinking. All they're thinking is crucify this Jesus. Now, as far as that applies to Pilate, Pilate's lost control of the crowd at this point. So, Pilate is responding to the crowd with another question. He asks, why what evil has he done? And we've already seen that there's the continued cry for crucifixion. Now, since that's true, since we have all this information in the verse, something else we should know here is that one reason Pilate asked the question that he does is because crucifixion was a punishment reserved only for people who were actively rebelling against Rome, and it was also a punishment for slaves. Jesus was neither. He was not rebelling against Rome. He was not a slave. And so Pilate wants to know why. This man in no way deserves crucifixion. But of course, the crowd ignores the question, and so Pilate has lost control of the crowd. And that's evidenced in the fact that they do ignore this question that Pilate asked. Anything else on verse 14? Okay. So verse 15, what does Pilate do? Gives in and satisfies the crowd. So the text says he released Barabbas for them. What does he do with Jesus? Has him scourged. And what else does the text say? He has him scourged and what? Handed him over to be crucified. So we have two aspects of what is done with Jesus here. First, he's scourged. Can anyone tell me what scourging is? What kind of whipped? It is a very severe form of whipping. And I'm going to tell you how severe. the information that I have. It was being whipped, but it was being whipped by whips that had on the end of them pieces of metal, bone, glass, very sharp kind of whipping. It would shred your skin to the point that you could sometimes see the bones underneath the skin. The under part of your body. That's what was done to Jesus. And this is still before the cross. Now, if you've seen the Passion of the Christ movie, and the way that movie renders it, you tie the person to a post, you're getting whipped all over your back. Your flesh is being torn apart. And what I described happens. You see the bones. Everything under the skin comes out. Now, that's pretty graphic. But I describe it because that's what Jesus went through for us. The cross was the end result of all this. But that pain began well before the cross. Now, has Jesus said anything up to this point? Nope. He's silent. Last time we hear from him is back in verse 2. For 13 verses, Jesus has said nothing. He will continue to say nothing until those few statements he makes on the cross. But that's what scourging is. It's not just being whipped. It is ripping your flesh while you are being whipped. So, as these things apply to what is happening to Jesus here, what is happening to him would continue to fulfill what he said would happen to him in passages like Mark 10, verse 34. Jesus said in that verse, where he called himself the Son of Man, he said, "They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again." The mocking, the spitting, and now the scourging is taking place, and more mocking will take place a little bit later when his dealings with the soldiers. Now, another passage we might tie in here from the Old Testament is Isaiah 53, verse 5, which says, "But he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed." The injuries of Jesus healed us. But again, this is about Pilate as well. The point we should see from verses 11 through 15 about why Pilate offered to release a prisoner is that he offered to release a prisoner because he wished to satisfy the crowd. Again, Pilate wants Jesus off his hands. So he releases Barabbas, because that's who the crowd wants. And he gives Jesus away to the soldiers that we'll talk about in our next Mark study. But Pilate was just wanting to please the crowd because he lost control of the crowd. A crowd that was consumed with the desire to have Jesus crucified. So Pilate releases Barabbas, has Jesus scourged, and hands him over to soldiers who would continue to mistreat Jesus before his crucifixion. Anything else on verse 15 before we wrap things up? All right. So when we consider everything from verses 6 through 15 of this chapter, the point we should be left with is that Pilate had reasons he offered to release a prisoner. Number one, because he knew why the religious leaders brought Jesus to him. And he offered to release a prisoner because he wished to satisfy the crowd. And so what we should learn from these things is that we must determine why we have anything to do with Jesus. Now again, based on what we've studied, what these verses are ultimately about is how Pilate deals with Jesus. As a result, these verses should cause us to examine how we deal with Jesus. It should cause us to examine our relationship with Jesus. Maybe they should cause us to examine why we came into contact with Jesus in the first place. If we do this, then this will help us to gain more insight into why God has allowed us to come into the relationship with Jesus that we have as followers of him. Now again, this is just some application. Any other questions or comments? All right. Matt, will you close us? Oh, Sandy, go ahead.
My mom and dad passed away Monday. Well, it was Tuesday.
Okay.